I would like to begin by thanking the government of Nepal for establishing an annual lecture series named after a seasoned and a pioneer diplomat who was one of the architects of the foreign policy of Nepal in modern times, the late Professor Yadu Khanal. I am for inviting me to deliver the inaugural lecture in the annual lecture series. My sincere thanks to Foreign Minister Dr. Khadka for placing his trust and confidence in me, to Foreign Secretary Bharat Raj Paudyal for his generous words of introduction, and to Mr. Bharat Regmi, Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and his staff for their warmth and hospitality extended to me. I am honored by the invitation and delighted to be here this afternoon, and I am honored by your presence here. I am particularly pleased to deliver this lecture since both the late Professor Khanal and I come from similar backgrounds from the western part of Nepal, the land blessed by the snow-fed Masangi River descending down from the Himalayas and its tributaries. I have a particular fascination with the Gandaki River, which is a major tributary to the river Ganges, the holy river. Quite early on in my academic career, I published a book on international watercourses law for the 21st century, with particular reference to the management, conservation, and equitable utilization of the water resources of the river Ganges basin. Ever since my time as a legal officer in the International Law and Treaties Division of the Ministry of Law and Justice, I have sought to develop myself as an international lawyer, ready and willing to serve the governments of Nepal on close to every major area of international law pertaining to the conduct of Nepal's foreign policy. Therefore, today, I feel privileged to have the opportunity to present my views on Nepal's foreign policy to such an august gathering. I would like to take this opportunity to pay my tribute to successive rulers of Nepal since its unification, including King Prithviraj Saha the Great, the unifier of the nation who laid the foundation of Nepal's foreign policy. Rana Prime Ministers, including Jang Bahadur Rana and Chandra Shamsher Jang Bahadur Rana, who, in my opinion, successfully safeguarded Nepal's independence during the period of aggressive colonization of Asian and African territories by the European powers. King Mahendra and Prime Minister B.P. Koirala, who strengthened Nepal's external relations on the basis of sovereign equality with its immediate neighbors and extended Nepal's relations with countries far and wide. King Birendra, for his innovative proposal to have Nepal declared a zone of peace, and Prime Minister Sher Bahadur Deuba and former Prime Ministers Girija Prasad Koirala, Krishna Prasad Bhattarai, K.P. Oli, Sushil Koirala, Prachanda, Malwa Nepal, Jhalnath Khanal, and Dr. Bauram Bhattarai for taking wise decisions to safeguard Nepal's national interest on major foreign policy issues of the day. I should state here that the 104 years old Rana oligarchical rule hindered Nepal's progress to modernity, and King Mahendra was wrong to dissolve an elected parliament, derail Nepal's journey to democracy, and imprison B.P. Koirala and many other elected representatives of the people. However, that does not diminish the significance of many bold decisions he took on foreign policy matters to assert Nepal's freedom of action and defend the sovereignty and independence of the country during tumultuous time in South Asia. Therefore, history is grateful to Rana Prime Ministers Janga Bahadur Rana, Chandra Shamsher Janga Bahadur Rana, and King Mahendra with regard to their contribution to foreign policy matters. I propose this afternoon, if I may, to present my analysis on Nepal's foreign policy, past, present, and future. My analysis is informed by my own research in international law aspects of Nepal's external relations and those of others who have labored in this area, including Professor Yadu Khanal. Now, please allow me to say a few words about Nepal's past foreign policy. Many of you know Nepal is an ancient state that has existed in various forms for more than 2,500 years. The existence of Nepal is mentioned in religious scriptures of ancient Hindu and Buddhist civilizations. Neolithical tools found during excavations in the Kathmandu Valley indicate that people were living here in the Himalayan region in the far distant past. The Mahabharata and other legendary epics mention geographical names and ethnic groups associated with Nepal, such as the Kiratas of Nepal. As I have outlined in my recent book on human rights in Eastern civilizations, published by Edward Elgar in the UK, the international law concept of Panchasheel has its roots in Nepal, the land of Lord Buddha. The principles of Panchasheel were not invented, but were developed over time based on Hindu, Buddhist philosophies, including such as live and let live, the world is one family, or Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and the Buddhist Panchashila, or 5 virtues, including non-violence. From studying the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata and other scriptures, it becomes clear that this part of the world has had some form of the law of nations, or jus gentium, we say in Latin, dealing with matters of interstate negotiations, conclusion of treaties, and humanitarian law or the laws of war before the development of modern international law in Europe. The history of modern Nepal began in the 16th century with the founding of the House of Gorkha by Dravya Saha in the western hills of Nepal in 1559. When Prithvinarayan Saha ascended to the throne of Gorkha, he began a campaign to unify the country, which had remained divided into several principalities. He largely succeeded in his campaign, and his coronation as the King of Nepal took place in 1768. You may remember that this was the time when the American Revolution for independence was gathering pace, and Britain had asserted control over vast swathes of land across the globe. Prithvinarayan Saha's description of Nepal is a yam between two stones, referring to the celestial empire of China to the north and the emperor of seas to the south, that's British India, summed up Nepal's position at the time. It is the first major statement on Nepal's foreign policy, which has not only entered the psyche of the people of Nepal, but also has guided foreign policy matters since then. The campaign of territorial expansion, which was started by Prithvinarayan Saha, was extended by his successors towards the east and west of Nepal through the Himalayan belt for almost 1,500 kilometers, from the western boundary of Garhwal, India, through the territory of Sikkim in the east. However, most of the territory gained had to be ceded to British India under the Treaty of Subedi in the early 19th century, when Nepal lost the Anglo-Nepalese War between 1814 and 1816. The war broke out mainly as a result of the British campaign for expansion of their empire in South Asia. The British desire was to bring all smaller territories south of the Himalayas within its control to consolidate British rule in India. Nepal resisted the aggression but was forced to sign a peace agreement with unfavorable terms. This is the second milestone in the annals of Nepal's external relations. The boundary set by the Treaty of Subedi remains valid to this day, and it has defined the place of Nepal in its dealings with the southern neighbor ever since. All successive governments of Nepal pursued a policy of isolation and some kind of rapprochement with the rulers of British India. Pleased with the cooperation received from Nepal, the British establishment went as far as to confer upon Rana Prime Minister Chandra Shamsher Jagara the honorary degree of Doctor of Civil Law, the highest accolade of the University of Oxford, in 1908, and he received it from the hands of Lord Curzon, the Chancellor of the University, during his visit to Great Britain. By maintaining cordial relations with British India, Nepal regained some of the lost territory and was able to secure a formal recognition of its independence and sovereignty through the 1923 treaty, concluded with Britain during the height of the British imperial power. This is the third major development in the history of international relations of Nepal. The fourth major development in Nepal's internal relations took place in the aftermath of the Second World War and the establishment of the United Nations, when Nepal established diplomatic relations with the United States, concluding a treaty of friendship and commerce on 25th April 1947. The fifth event of significance for Nepal is the conclusion of the 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship with independent India following the British withdrawal from South Asia. This treaty is significant for two main reasons. First, it was more or less a modified version of the 1923 treaty with Britain. And second, it defines the nature and scope of Nepal's relations with India. This treaty remains controversial for several reasons. My article on this treaty, which was published in 1994 in the Asian Survey, the journal edited by the legendary Professor Leo Rose of the University of California, is widely recognized as an authoritative statement on the status, nature, and scope of this treaty. I refer anybody interested in this treaty in greater detail to this article. The sixth major milestone in Nepal's external relations is its membership of the United Nations in 1955, which was followed by an ambitious expansion of Nepal's external relations under the leadership of King Mahendra and Prime Minister B.P. Koirala. And both of them benefited greatly from the wisdom and foresight of a number of luminaries of the time, including Professor Nath Khanal, in whose honor we are holding this lecture today. Nepal's attempt to protect itself from any untoward developments in the region and any potential outside interference led to the proposition by King Brendra in that Nepal be declared a zone of peace. In my opinion, it was an innovative idea designed to seek international endorsement of Nepal's status as a peace-loving, independent, and traditionally neutral country when South Asia was going through challenging times. The proposal was also consistent with the centuries-old foreign policy of Nepal pursued since the time of King Prithviraj Saha. The support of a considerable number of states, including the United States, for this proposal was a major triumph for Nepal's foreign policy. Nepal has reached out to other nations and played an important role in international organizations such as the United Nations. Nepal is a regular contributor to the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations. As a landlocked country, Nepal has been at the forefront of the efforts to secure the rights of landlocked countries in international law, especially during the negotiations of the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. When I go abroad attending international conferences, many people from that time still refer to the leadership Nepal was able to provide within the negotiations leading to the conclusion of the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea. Overall, the conduct of Nepal's foreign policy has largely met three essential conditions, or 3 C's of a sound foreign policy, that is, continuity, consistency, and credibility. Most of the decisions taken by various successive governments on major international issues, whether within the United Nations or outside, have been principled, demonstrating Nepal's faith in international law, including the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Now, please allow me to say a few things about Nepal's present foreign policy. Nepal's foreign policies tend to be in the pursuit of 3 main objectives. First, asserting and protecting Nepal's freedom of action and maintaining its own equilibrium vis-a-vis its 2 larger neighbors. Second, economic development. Third, upholding the principles of Panchashil and the Charter of the United Nations and strengthening the rules-based international order. However, Nepal's foreign policy continues to be affected by its geostrategic location between the 2 giants of Asia and preoccupied by its attempt to maintain a balance between these powerful neighbors. In my opinion, this doesn't have to be so. Like any other nation, Nepal has its own challenges and opportunities offered by the fast-changing world events and the dynamics of the rapidly evolving formal and informal alliances of nations for various purposes. Professor Khanal wrote about the somewhat somber mood caused by the fact that as the least developed country with a small volume of international trade and not much to offer by way of a give and take, Nepal has little to offer to countries such as the United States to attract adequate attention. However, his assessment that the Nepalese ambassador to Washington DC, among the ambassadors of prosperous and powerful countries, was a lonely ambassador, was informed by the conditions that prevailed in the 1960s and 70s. Today's world is very different. Nepal, as a yam between 2 stones, is a story of yesterday. It is a constraining notion that limits Nepal's global ambitions and restricts Nepal to managing bilateral relations between the immediate neighbors. Nepal doesn't have to be shackled by this mindset in today's world of globalization of thoughts, ideas, connectivity in different areas of human activity. Globalization and social media have revolutionized human civilization in the past few decades. There is an ever-growing global interest in the values of the East, since Eastern concepts such as non-violence, yoga, vegetarianism, nirvana, karma, meditation and mindfulness, all informed by the teachings of Buddha, have become global phenomena. Hence, Nepal, as the land of Buddha, has much to offer to the world, and the world is increasingly attracted to Nepal. Materialistic wealth is not the only form of wealth. Therefore, Nepal should overcome the underdeveloped, insignificant, and small state syndrome. In terms of the size of the population, Nepal is a middle power by global standards. I share the optimism of the British historian Percival Landon about Nepal's past, present, and future, beautifully narrated in his book on Nepal, published in 2 volumes, in London in 1928 and reprinted in 1993. He states, quote, Nepal alone among Asiatic powers has never suffered either the galling triumph of the Muslim or the political or commercial results of Christian expansion, unquote. Nepal can be proud of its past and ambitious for the future, for itself and for the region. It wants to come out of the Sino-Indian preoccupation of its foreign policy and go even beyond the Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation known as BIMSTEC and the currently dysfunctional South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation known as SAARC. With the gradual military and diplomatic pivot to Asia or rebalancing of strategic priorities, the amount of international attention on this continent, including this region, will increase considerably in the years and decades to come. The competition for the expansion of spheres of influence in this part of the world will intensify among the major global powers, whose geopolitical strategies will certainly impact Nepal. Therefore, the country has to be alert and wise in dealing with the ramifications of the changing dynamics of international relations. While Nepal has to maintain, of course, its own equilibrium with the 2 of its larger immediate neighbors, it has to ready itself to deal with the challenges and benefit from the opportunities brought about by the shift in attention in world politics. With this in mind, I would like to make a few suggestions this afternoon for the future foreign policy of Nepal. My suggestions are not temporal measures sparked by any specific current world events. Rather, they are recommendations for the country's long-term foreign policy objectives. Therefore, I would like to outline my views with regard to the future foreign policy of Nepal. Nepal ought to have a vision and strategy in place to make constructive contributions to regional and global affairs and benefit from globalization. Nepal is well placed to do so, thereby earning its place and respect in the galaxy of nations that it deserves. The current version of the document outlining the aims and objectives of Nepal's foreign policy, adopted some 3 years ago, is comprehensive and a commendable document. However, Nepal would do well by focusing on a few areas in which it had the capacity to deliver results and the areas in which it has a comparative advantage. This is what smaller countries like Austria, Switzerland, Singapore, and the Netherlands have done. As a relatively small nation territorially, Nepal has to have an outstanding, distinctive international agenda as part of its foreign policy to promote itself and to help further good causes in the wider world, so that the world looks to Nepal for specialism and leadership in the chosen areas. I propose to highlight some of the possibilities for Nepal. In my opinion, if Nepal has a positive message to convey to the world and leads in converting this message into actions, it will elevate its status globally. Nepal is well placed to shout loud from the top of the world a global message of change for the better, and the world is bound to listen to Nepal's authoritative, legitimate voice of reason. As Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan said, the gates of the future are wide open for any individuals and nations determined to succeed in their mission. The next recommendation I have is to do with diplomacy for development. As Nelson Mandela once said, while poverty persists, there can be no meaningful freedom. And this is true for Nepal. Although Nepal's centuries-old Hindu-Buddhist tradition embodied many early elements of human rights, such as respect for personal liberty, the country remains impoverished. The prosperity of developed nations is underpinned by values such as competition, fair play, the rule of law, personal liberty, and a strong work ethic. And they are as vital for Nepal as they are for any other nations. Therefore, the foreign policy of Nepal should be geared to advancing economic development grounded in these values. Nepal has experienced manifold tragedies, political upheavals, and insurgencies since it emerged in the 1950s from its centuries-old self-imposed isolation under various oligarchical rulers. However, since the adoption of a new democratic and inclusive constitution in 2015, the country has been on the road to some degree of political stability, and today it stands on the threshold of a new life. Nepal may be a conservative country culturally, but politically it is a liberal country. And the Nepali people have a universalistic outlook to life. The Nepali people deserve their peace dividend. And the foreign policy of Nepal ought to be designed to achieve this purpose. Diplomacy for development should not only be about attracting more foreign aid or increasing tourism, but it should also be about readying the country to benefit from globalization and international treaties on trade and investment and the protection of the environment. My second recommendation is about attracting, managing, and retaining foreign investment. In order to attract and manage foreign investment in the best interest of the country and maximize the benefits from it, Nepal needs to have a political stability and a strong rule of law, supported by an independent judiciary and respect for human rights. The experience of many countries show that attracting foreign investment is a means to an end and not an end in itself. Securing foreign investment is not the end goal. It is a means used to reach a goal. The goal could be to boost a certain area of industry or economic activity, or create a vital infrastructure, or empower the people in certain sectors of the economic activity, or to stimulate the economy. Many countries which attracted foreign investment without a fixed solid goal for the investment have not benefited much from the investment in long term. Therefore, the challenge for Nepal is to have a sensible national legal and policy framework in place to attract, manage, and retain foreign investment to maximize the benefits of the investment for the country. For this purpose, a bilateral investment treaty must include provisions, among others, the transfer of technology, employment of local people in meaningful positions, use of local raw material, requirement to invest a certain percentage of the profits in the country, contribution to the local economy, protection of the local environment, and a respect for human rights. Then only the foreign investment will benefit the people of the country. Because of Nepal's strategic location, its favorable climatic conditions, its reputation as a tourist haven, as a gateway to the Tibet Autonomous Region of China, as a country which traditionally pursues the policy of neutrality or non-alignment, vis-a-vis not only its immediate neighbors, but also other major powers outside of the region, Nepal is well placed to attract foreign investment. Nepal, like any other country, when involved in concluding bilateral investment agreements or so-called preferential trade agreements or free trade agreements known as FTAs, or to be fully up to date not only with the practice of treaty making by other states, but also with the recent trends in jurisprudence, or we always call it a case law. For example, the meaning accorded to a principle of international investment law today by an international tribunal could be different from that accorded 10 or 20 years ago. We are living in a fast developing and a rapidly changing world. Even the bilateral investment treaty known as BIPA, concluded with India only about a decade ago, is already looking outdated. India itself is going through a process of review of its foreign investment policy. Many states have declared that they now want to review the bilateral investment treaties concluded in the past, and some states have even withdrawn from the 1966 International Convention on the Settlement of Investment Disputes known as ICSID, claiming that the mechanism for investor-state dispute settlement under bilateral investment treaties has worked in favor of big foreign companies and undermined the sovereignty of developing states. From the experience of a number of countries which sought to attract foreign investment, I gather that the decisive factors of foreign investors when choosing a country for investment are political stability, impartial implementation of the rule of law, independent judiciary, sound regulatory regime, control of corruption, and transparency and decision making. Nepal ought to address comprehensively each of these components if the country hopes to attract major investment to improve its infrastructure. Therefore, Nepal's foreign policy cannot be separated from the domestic policy of strengthening democracy and upholding the rule of law and human rights. The next recommendation I have is developing Nepal as an international financial services center. Another possibility would be to develop Nepal as a financial services center along the lines of Switzerland, Singapore, Andorra, Jersey, or even the Isle of Man. If the people in both Nepal's and neighboring countries grow richer, they would be looking to deposit their money in a safe, neutral country, with a traditional image of a relatively neutral country, which cannot at the same time go against the basic interests of either China or India. Nepal could be an attractive place for people for safeguarding their savings. If properly developed within an acceptable level of an international legal framework, and if managed and regulated well, the role of a financial services center can become a sizable source of revenue generation for Nepal. International experience has shown that those who are well off wish to spread their wealth by depositing their wealth into bank accounts in different safe and secure locations. For this, Nepal should maintain a strict and strong equilibrium with both of its neighbors, present itself as a safe and neutral venue to do business, and have a robust framework of laws designed to protect investment and regulate the financial services industry according to international standards. The next suggestion I have is developing Nepal as a transit state. Regardless of the boundary or territorial disputes between them, the volume of trade between China and India has increased rapidly in the recent past, and it is bound to accelerate in the years and decades to come. Therefore, Nepal should strive to develop its infrastructure to serve as a transit state for the trade of goods and services between these two countries, and invest in making various passes along the Himalaya range more accessible and suitable for the carriage of goods for cross-border trade. The government should establish a powerful interministerial committee led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to work out the details, including an international legal framework for this purpose. It is by developing their port and airport services or other areas of service sector that countries and cities like Singapore, Hong Kong and Rotterdam have prospered. Nepal can do the same vis-à-vis the cross-border trade and supply of services between China and India. The proposal to build a railway tunnel under the Himalayas to link western Tibet with Kathmandu is visionary and exciting, provided that it can be done without causing significant harm to the Himalayan ecology. If China and India and Nepal can work together to take the Himalayan railway line from Tibet to the Indian cities bordering Nepal, it will be a game changer in this part of the world. The next suggestion I have is establishing a center for Himalayan peace studies. Although modernity has transformed the Kathmandu Valley over the past half century, and it now struggles with the impact of pollution and overcrowding, it remains a Shangri-La. And the country traditionally known as the land of meditation and contemplation, or a Nepali Gyan Bhumi, Tapo Bhumi, still offers abundant opportunities to work towards achieving peace both within the region and beyond. Therefore, Nepal would do well by establishing a center for Himalayan peace studies, similar to the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development known as ICIMOD, already operating in Kathmandu. The new center that I have proposed can act as an important vehicle to promote peace in the region. Nepal could play a constructive role to promote peace in the region and create an environment conducive to facilitating and hopefully, ultimately, resolving many long-standing and potentially explosive boundary and territorial disputes in this part of the world, whether between India and Pakistan or between China and India. Supported by the work of this proposed new center, Nepal could aspire to be an objective, independent and impartial peace negotiator and peace broker. Judicial mechanism is not the only option at the disposal of states to settle their territorial boundary disputes. International law provides a wide range of flexible techniques to resolve international disputes, and any of these techniques could be developed and deployed for the benefit of the countries concerned. There is a general ambivalence on the part of Asian countries to resort to international judicial mechanisms such as the International Court of Justice to settle major territorial boundary disputes for a number of reasons, including the traditional perception of their Eurocentric or Western-dominated character, both in terms of the manner in which the law has been interpreted and applied by these institutions and the culture that prevails in the workings of these institutions. Nepal's role as an impartial peace broker can become a catalyst in resolving some of the long-standing major boundary or territorial disputes in this part of the world and enhance Nepal's prestige regionally and internationally. What I have suggested may sound a tall order, but if Nepal wishes to be ambitious in the conduct of its foreign policy, playing a role of this nature is by no means impossible. In the Shakuntal Mahakavya, written by the great poet of Nepal, Mahakavi Devkota, the advice given by the learned but not wealthy father to his daughter when sending her off to the wealthy and powerful household of her husband. Meaning, remember that we are rich intellectually and be proud of it when dealing with others in your new household. In my opinion, is also a good advice for Nepal as a country. A country with a rich cultural heritage that can aspire to become a force for good in this region. When I say a force for good, this means can be characterized as an action inspired by a genuine concern with others. From experience, I know the positive impact can be achieved on all levels by manifold actions. The next suggestion I have, you will not be surprised, I as an international lawyer, is a proposal to establish a center for international law in Nepal of international standing. Why? I will explain. When I was a scholar at Oxford, we used to debate the role of law in the international community in the so-called Trinity term seminars, led jointly by Professor Sir Ian Brownlee, Professor of International Law, and Professor Sir Adam Roberts, Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. We debated whether international law dictated international relations or vice versa. The view was, of course, divided. I am sure that will be divided here in this gathering as well. But I personally held the belief that faith in international law was sine qua non for the survival of nations, and especially for smaller and weaker states, and of the rules-based international order. Professor Yadu Khanal rightly states that trying to keep abreast of international law is a worthy goal of Nepal. Both national and international conditions demand this, unquote. International law is the ultimate refuge for states, and especially for smaller and weaker states. I remember the following statement of a leader of one of the Latin American states, quote, "Disrespect for international law leads to the law of jungle, and in that jungle, we Latins are not the lion." In South Asia, Nepal is not the lion. It can roar, but its roar may remain unheeded. Therefore, reliance on international law is certainly a safe and prudent option for Nepal, whether it is in relation to territorial or boundary disputes or other issues affecting the country. International law will have an increasingly meaningful role to play in the years and decades to come. Therefore, Nepal must pay serious attention to the study and research of international law and strengthen its capacity to utilize the tools of international law to achieve its foreign policy objectives. It is not only a matter of understanding international law per se, but also a matter of understanding how the various principles of international law have been interpreted and applied by international courts and tribunals, including the International Court of Justice situated in The Hague. Cardinal Richelieu is reported to have said, let me quote him again, "I do not care so much who makes the laws or what the laws are, so much as who interprets and applies the laws." That indeed is the key to the current challenges for many developing countries which have not invested enough in the study of international law. Developing countries like Nepal must develop their capacity to make the most of international law. Nepal should endeavor to transit from a rule taker to a rule shaker, and finally to a rule maker, certainly in those areas that matter most to the country. It should be borne in mind that concluding a treaty with another state is a more serious task and commitment than simply writing a new constitution or enacting a new piece of legislation for one's own state only. This is because a law enacted by one's parliament can be amended any time by the same parliament or a future parliament. Even a constitution for a country written today can be amended tomorrow. Many constitutions around the globe have been amended so many times. The example of the Indian Constitution is a very relevant example. On the other hand, once a treaty is concluded with another state, no parliament or government can amend the treaty without the consent of another state, and that state is unlikely to consent to any amendments to the treaty if its original provisions are more beneficial to that state than the newly proposed ones. The country that concludes treaties with other countries without fully grasping the pros and cons of the treaty at hand do so at their peril, as treaties are usually binding for a considerable amount of time, sometimes for 50, 70 or even 99 years. There is nothing you can do about it. When highlighting the significance of international law for a developing country such as Nepal, I am not implying that every rule of international law is fair for developing countries. The developed and Western countries have dominated international lawmaking thus far, and consequently the laws made by them tend to favor Western and developed countries rather than developing countries. Most of the developing countries have been receivers of the laws made by developed countries. They are usually not the creator of the laws. This is why some of the rules of international law are not fair for developing countries. Therefore, developing countries like Nepal could act in concert with other like-minded states to make vital contributions to international lawmaking. Nepal can aspire to do so in the areas of its primary concern, such as protection of the Himalayan ecology, the trade and transit rights of landlocked countries, differential and preferential treatment for low-income countries, and sharing, management and conservation of the shared water resources in an equitable, fair and mutually beneficial manner. For instance, the world is already experiencing unusual weather patterns and climatic extremes in several parts of the world. Snow is reported to be receding fast in the Himalayas due to climate change and global warming. We hear that greening is always good, but greening of the Himalayas is not good. If the vegetation replaces the snow, then the Himalayas, the water supply would be drastically diminished. If the Himalayan ecology continues to deteriorate due to global warming, hundreds of millions of people whose survival depends on the water supply from the water tanks fed by the Himalayan streams will be faced with a life-threatening situation. It is in such areas that Nepal should aspire to provide leadership in the international level. And I hope that the idea of Sagarmatha Samvad, initiated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs some time ago, will be revived. Initiative of this nature can enable Nepal to play a leadership role regionally and internationally. As Nepal looks to the future, the role of international law in nation building will gain significance. Law is an instrument to achieve desired objectives, and international law serves this purpose too. The challenge for developing countries such as Nepal is to build capacity in how to use international law effectively. Therefore, there is a need for a proper think tank devoted to the study of and research in international law in Nepal. And I hope the government will take the decision to establish such an organization. International law is not only about governing external relations of a country, but it is also about regulating its economic activities. For instance, the role of international economic law has changed. International economic law has become a champion of liberal economy and free trade, designed to empower and benefit the person, whether natural or juridical. Much of the World Trade Organization law and the international law of foreign investment are designed to protect and enhance individual entrepreneurship and protect and promote individual innovation through intellectual property protection. The ultimate objective is to create a borderless world of a global village where a free flow of goods, capital and services can take place. The center that I have proposed could assist the government to maximize the benefits offered by international law. The proposed center could also be entrusted with the task of exploring the possibility of developing Nepal as a regional arbitration center. Legal services have been a major source of income, not only for countries with a well-established reputation for the independence of the judiciary and a robust rule of law, such as the United Kingdom, but also other countries such as Singapore, which has an ambitious scheme to develop itself as a regional hub for international arbitration. Given Nepal's traditional reputation as a non-aligned country with a temperate weather and touristic destination, Nepal is well placed to serve as an attractive venue for resolutions of international commercial disputes, including international arbitration. Some of the reasons why the UK in general and London in particular has been successful in attracting international legal business, including international commercial arbitration, are that it has a trusted legal system, an independent judiciary, and reputable institutions that offer first-class arbitration services. It also has a stable and relatively clean politics, a reliable, relatively honest, professional, and politically neutral civil service, a generally liberal and global outlook among both politicians and the general public, and a relatively low crime rate. The UK also affords a lot of importance to international law, more so than many other countries. Nepal may not have all the favorable conditions to attract international legal business, still it has many more than other countries in Asia. There are plenty of direct and indirect benefits of developing Nepal as a regional hub for international commercial disputes, such as the generation of additional revenue for Nepal, the development of the service sector, and the enhancement of Nepal's prestige internationally. The next suggestion I have is to move towards a policy of permanent neutrality for Nepal. The Hindu Kush Himalayan belt, extending from Myanmar, previously known as Burma, to Afghanistan, has endured external interference and internal political upheavals because of its strategic significance to regional and global politics and long-standing territorial and boundary disputes among the states in the area. Given the unfolding new dynamics of international relations, this region may once again be drawn into the conflict over the expansion of the spheres of influence of different international actors. Therefore, many of the foreign policy challenges for Nepal are as great today as they have been in the past. Therefore, Nepal could thus consider moving towards adopting a policy of permanent neutrality, similar to that pursued by Switzerland, for the benefit of the Nepalese people and those of the wider Hindu Kush Himalayan belt. The next suggestion I have is a meaningful representation of Nepal in international organizations. Despite Nepal's contribution to the United Nations peacekeeping and to the maintenance of the rules-based international order in an impartial and independent manner over a long period of time, its representation in the United Nations and other international organizations has not been as strong as it should be. No Nepali national has ever occupied a senior executive level position in the core area of business of these organizations. Most of the past and present positions occupied by Nepalese nationals have been peripheral to the main powers and functions of these organizations. For instance, Nepal remains one of a very few countries that has never been represented in the United Nations International Law Commission with 34 members, let alone in the International Court of Justice. Some strategic planning should be put in place to identify the right candidates for the right positions and to promote them accordingly so that they can gain experience and exposure needed to compete successfully for such positions. Due to the political upheavals experienced within the country over the past several decades, Nepali political leaders have not paid adequate attention to project Nepal internationally and promote Nepali nationals abroad. Since some degree of political stability has now been achieved in the country, the time has come to be assertive in the international arena. There are huge long-term and short-term benefits of doing so for the country. Now, please allow me to say a few words about domestic challenges of foreign policy. Professor Khanal is right in stating that, I quote, "Foreign policy cannot be pursued in isolation from home policy," unquote. The liberal economic policy pursued by international trade and investment organizations and the values embedded in international trade and investment treaties enable the strong to succeed in this strongly interdependent and globalized world. To succeed in this tough competitive global environment, every country has to put in place policies designed to produce first-rate intellectuals and professionals. Unfortunately, Nepalese institutions of higher education, and especially those in the public sector, have not been able to produce leading intellectuals and professionals up to the level expected. In fact, their ability to do so has diminished over the past several decades due to political interference in the management of these institutions. Political interference in the civil service has also eroded the professionalism and political neutrality of the civil service and its capacity to deliver the desired outcomes. The institutions are free of political interference produce the best students who are ready to take on the world and succeed in the competitive global environment. Unfortunately, a large number of youths of Nepal are compelled to take up low-income and unskilled or low-skilled jobs in the Gulf countries and elsewhere. This is an ongoing tragedy which is not conducive to Nepal succeeding in the race to the top in an increasingly competitive world. Economic diplomacy and domestic policy are intertwined, and for the former to succeed, a paradigm shift is needed in the latter. We know that in democracy, everybody is a politician, but not every youth needs to be indoctrinated into party politics from early on in life. It can be counterproductive for the development of the individual as well as the country. Youth should be encouraged to spend time learning and developing skills to be able to compete in a fiercely competitive world, and should not be called upon to carry party political flags to serve the interests of political leaders. The educational establishment in Nepal, the temples of knowledge, should be free of party politics so that they can focus on producing first-rate intellectuals and professionals, generating knowledge and developing specialism. The youth of today are the future of any country, and if this foundation is weak, the prospects for a country's tomorrow are not compelling. Now, I would like to conclude with few remarks. A country located between the two giants of Asia, Nepal has traditionally strategically followed a sensible policy to preserve its sovereignty and independence and retain much of its ancient cultural heritage. A British scholar observed that, quote, of all the states of the world, there is probably a no more fiercely patriotic country than Nepal, unquote. However, this country would do well by taking a step up in its foreign policy to project itself internationally, and I, for one, am ready to assist. I am confident that we can assemble a group of prominent international lawyers from within and outside of this region to assist Nepal. Nepal has to grow out of a yam between the two stones mindset, that the self-defeating notions of an insignificant, impoverished and peripheral state tucked away in the southern flank of the Himalayas. The foreign policy of Nepal must have a global outlook. It must go beyond its preoccupation with the management of relations with its two immediate neighbors. If some of the ideas I have outlined this afternoon were implemented, Nepal would be poised to gain power and influence in regional politics and make inroads into global politics. The country, as a cradle of Hindu-Buddhist civilizations, has served in the past as a bridge between the Indian and Chinese civilization for millennia, spreading the message of peace, universalism, multiculturalism and tolerance. Therefore, there is every prospect of more prosperity for Nepal, provided that the country is able to put in place sensible policies designed to exploit its comparative advantage and its geostrategic status. If the economic power shifts gradually to the east, any of the initiatives that I have outlined today are bound to pay off tomorrow. Nepal may be perceived to be a small country, but the dreams of the Nepali people are not small. I hope the Nepalese foreign policy will rise to the challenge to realize some of the dreams of the Nepalese people. May this nation live long as a beacon of peace and freedom in this part of the world. And I thank you for your kind attention. I now would be happy to entertain some questions. As the Foreign Secretary announced already, about 20-25 minutes. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask it now, and please, when doing so, identify yourself. Raise your hands and identify yourself, who you are and which institution you represent. And my request again, please be very short and specific to the question rather than making your own observations.
This is Paras Kibire, former career ambassador to Burma, Myanmar, till 5 years back. Many thanks for the wonderful presentations on various dimensions of Nepalese foreign policy. I have twofold queries and curiosities. One, at a time when Nepal is believed to be wisely pursuing its policy of non-alignment with the community of nations across the world, our natural concern here obviously is how well, how best, and how effectively has Nepal been walking a fine line and navigating its signature non-aligned foreign policy in its political, economic, and diplomatic engagements with emerging India, rising China, and the only remaining superpower to best serve its overall national interests and ideals. Your take on this is one. And second and last, I'll finish quickly. It's no wonder that Nepal has been receiving foreign aid and development assistance since our planned development efforts way back in 2012 साल विक्रम संवतदेखि corresponding to 1956-80. It is now 66 years and counting. At this point, how do we make a distinction and draw a line here and explain to us with a timeline or time frame when Nepal would stop inviting and accepting any foreign aid component for furthering our national economic development? Is it 50 years hence, 80 years hence, 100 years hence, or never ever? And allow Nepal and the Nepalese to carve and predetermine our own destiny and a forward-looking future. Is it not the time for Nepal to emerge as a self-reliant and self-dependent nation? Your assessment on this also. That's it for now. Thank you.
One of your suggestions was that Nepal should move toward policy of permanent neutrality. Today we can see many of the countries, they are renouncing the policy of neutrality, moving towards alliances, or at least drifting towards that direction. So in that context, could you please elaborate on rationale behind the need for weighting Nepal's foreign policy to doctrine of permanent neutrality, and as well as what would be modalities or mechanisms to achieve that? Thank you. My name is Subhanga Parajoli. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
As you are also an expert in international investment law, and you also touched upon and talked about attracting, managing, and retaining foreign investment in your lecture. I would appreciate if you could elaborate more on what should be the main policy considerations for Nepal when concluding future bilateral investment treaties with other countries to attract foreign investment. Thank you.
First of all, the first question, yes, the policy of non-alignment has been in existence for a long time. As I said, beginning from Prithviraj Shaha's statement that Nepal is a yam between two states. That was in a way some indication what should be the foreign policy of Nepal. And Professor Yadu Khanal and many of the architects of Nepal's foreign policy in the 1950s and 60s, when Nepal came out of the period of isolation, was pursued. So this continues to be the case. But my presentation today was not only about how Nepal should conduct itself in international fora, but what should Nepal's own foreign policy. That ties up very nicely with the last question by the lady from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the gentleman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a policy of permanent neutrality. Because the two decades of 1970s and 80s were the decades when there was some degree of alliance or alignment of developing countries. As a result of that one, comprehensive treaties like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea were concluded, very fair in my opinion. Of all the international treaties concluded, that is a very fair agreement for both developed and developing countries. That was possible. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, fall of the Berlin Wall, and coming down of the Iron Curtain, the relevance of NAM has reduced drastically. Now, when I observe the policy pursued by different states in various international fora, in which I myself have been participating in different capacities, I can see states pursuing their own national interest first, rather than collective interests of either developing countries or these groupings or that grouping of states. Most states in the international fora in which I have participated have promoted their national interest first. Therefore, the time has come for Nepal to also have its own foreign policy independent of any of these alliances and declare Nepal as a permanently neutral country. Given the background that I have highlighted, the so-called pivot to Asia or rebalancing the strategic interests and what is going on internationally in various international fora, I think the situation that we witnessed in the 70s and 80s may repeat itself. Therefore, not only for Nepal's own good, but for the good of the region, the whole Hindu Kush Himalayan belt, from Myanmar to Afghanistan, Nepal would do very well. Given its geostrategic location, given the developments taking place globally, Nepal would do well by considering making itself, adopting a policy of permanent neutrality along the lines of Switzerland. With regard to your question, very interesting question, modality. It is through a unilateral declaration. A state can make a declaration, although traditionally the policy of neutrality was declared in relation to a war, a conflict. But some states have declared a policy of permanent neutrality, even without there being a looming armed conflict or without there being a background of an armed conflict. So Nepal can do so through a unilateral declaration and bringing it to the attention of the international community. And then gradually seek some sort of endorsement from the international community, could be the United Nations or through bilateral means. And with regard to the question about international investment law, very interesting question, thank you. Yes, Nepal remains an impoverished country economically. And many countries have benefited a great deal by attracting foreign investment. But some countries have attracted a lot of foreign investment, but that investment has not worked well for the country. I don't want to give some examples now. Many of you are diplomats here, but I have said so in my academic writings. So to benefit from foreign investment, you have to have a sound and sensible foreign policy, investment policy. Countries were in a rush. If you look at the Economist, the weekly news magazine, go back to the pages, the last pages in the 1990s. All countries were offering tax holidays. Oh, you don't have to pay capital gains tax. You don't have to pay corporate gains tax. Tax holiday, tax haven, tax holiday for 10 years, 15 years, with a view to attract foreign investment. But that policy worked well for some countries. They have benefited a lot, developed their economy, but some other countries have not. Therefore, Nepal has to have a sensible foreign investment policy, and more importantly, the treaties concluded 20 years ago. The nature and scope of each and every word. I have practiced as an international investment lawyer before international courts and tribunals. Know from my own experience, the interpretation of the words, of the phrases that you have included in the treaty today may come to haunt you tomorrow if you are not very careful, if you have not understood the nature, scope and meaning of each and every word and article in the treaty. With that in mind, that's what I have proposed. If Nepal were to establish a Center for International Law, that center could advise the government on investment policy. Whether Nepal can afford, for instance, Nepal has concluded, I will give an example with Norway, so-called DDTA, Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement. In that agreement, the mechanism for dispute resolution is very different from the mechanism for dispute resolution in bilateral investment treaty. That could be a model without having to recourse to international litigative process, judicial mechanisms, some sort of a mediation, conciliation could take place. The priority could be given to that one. So the time has come for Nepal to reflect on not only treaty making, but current state practice, current case law, what is happening. Can Nepal afford to litigate before expensive international courts and tribunals? Should things go wrong? Should foreign investors decide to sue Nepal before international courts and tribunals? They are very expensive undertakings. Therefore, can Nepal afford to do so? Nepal is a party to the ICSID Convention of 1966. Nepal is a party to a number of bilateral investment treaties. Nepal will have to conclude other bilateral investment treaties in the future with the targeted countries from where substantial foreign investment is likely to come. But the provision for dispute resolution has to be thought through very carefully. That is the reason many states have decided to terminate the existing BITs or renegotiate the existing bilateral investment treaties, or say that if you are going to invest in our country, have your faith in the judicial system of the country itself. If you and I as individuals go on a holiday to foreign country, should something happen against us, we can't claim a special privilege. We have to go to the local court to seek legal remedy against any harm done to us as individuals. Why should foreign investors enjoy or be entitled to a privileged status whereby they can sue the host government before an international court and tribunal? If the judiciary is independent, if the rule of law is robust, some countries have started to say that if you have faith in our system, you have to have faith in our democratic system, then you have to have faith in our judicial system. That's where it starts. We don't want to go to international courts and tribunals to litigate a case brought against the government by a foreign investor. These are just possibilities. Nepal may not have attained that status at the moment, but to consider whether the dispute settlement mechanism, as I said, one example could be the mechanism already in place. I give an example, the Nepal-Norway double taxation avoidance agreement could be an example to consider, or some other mechanism, or developing Nepal itself as a regional hub for arbitration and including it in the treaty. One can be innovative and say we have developed our own arbitration center, independent center, not associated with the government, not a part of the judiciary. So any dispute arising out of it, you can go to this commercial tribunal within the country itself. So there are a number of possibilities for the country to consider. Nepal has to attract, in my opinion, I don't have data, I am not an economist, but Nepal has not been able to attract a big foreign investment. Foreign investment is coming through, but the substantial amount of investment Nepal stands to attract is not coming in. To stimulate the economy, to get the economy grow faster than it has to aim to attract a big amount of foreign investment. For that, it has to offer assurances that should something go wrong, they can resort to judicial means or other means of dispute resolution which can be accepted by prospective foreign investors. Thank you. Now I will go for the second round.
My name is Hari. I also work in the Foreign Ministry. Professor, you mentioned, you recommended that Nepal should become a transit state, and you explained the operational aspect of being a transit state. My question is about the international law aspect. Be it GATT Article 5 or UNCLOS, talks about two kinds of state, transit state, landlocked state. Now, here we are talking about Nepal, a landlocked country, being a transit state. So what does it mean? How does it fit in international law? Or let's say, calling ourselves a transit state, does it have an impact on our status in international law as a landlocked country? Thank you, sir.
I'm Surya Prasad. I'm a journalist. As the non-aligned was the concept developed during the Cold War era, when the world was divided into, the world was bipolar, but now the world has changed into unipolar and then to the multipolar. So still non-alignment is relevant. What do you think? And my next question is, do you think that the position Nepal has taken during the Russia-Ukraine war was correct?
I'm Ramesh Tungel from Lumbini Buddhist University. First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Subedi. It's wonderful for your wonderful presentation. After a long time, I got opportunity to hear in this program. My question is just related to the area I'm involved, touching the point of international relations or foreign relations of Nepal. You touched that point at the end. I missed first part because of my late presence here. Sorry for that. But it seems that you haven't highlighted as most important point for that, because you dealt at the end touching that point. This is about software diplomacy. Should we not start, as you said, one policy of neutrality, are attached with software policy? I would like to bring few examples. For example, going back to history, we haven't been able to even trace how much works our ancestors have done in this, related area. One example, if we talk about Khasa Kingdom or Empire, I just came back from Siza Valley in Jumla area last week, and even today we can see everywhere the edicts and the evidences of making a nation that time with what they call a Kirti Khamba. Hundreds and thousands of them. If you start collecting those, hundreds of Kirti Khambas are there still. And if we go through archival sources, about 1,000 monasteries they had established in the Himalaya, including now they are not within the territory of Nepal. Those were the empires which are that was the empire, or the power has been as a important base for the development of this nation, Nepal. Basis for the development of this type of society, this type of country, but we haven't done a single necessary research work for those. Where are those monasteries? We got to cross the border and start researching, around the Mansarovar or Kailas area for many hundreds. And we got to go up to Bodh Gaya, crossing the border in India to find their Kirti there, and start advocating through culture and software power, software diplomacy. Because in the modern time, modern boundary system or boundary nationalism, border nationalism is very strong. but culture doesn't have boundary.
Yeah, thank you.
So we can, I think, should we not focus on this aspect,
Okay.
touching, attaching with the neutrality, policy of neutrality and cultural software, policy.
Thank you.
I'm Saroj Gimire. I'm the assistant professor of Tribhuvan University and faculty of law for investment law, international law, and constitutional law. Each time when you deliver thing, each time I thought to frame a question. Subsequently, you answered. So the question that was in my mind, you have already answered. But I have one important issue that I'd like to request for your suggestions. That whenever there is a very important issues of the foreign policies, we witness the conflict between the politics and the bureaucracy, especially the foreign affairs. And I was waiting your suggestions that how you would be suggesting to balance the conflict between the politics and the bureaucracy. So if you can extend any suggestions on the critical issues, how the politics and bureaucracy comes to the same point for our benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. These are very interesting questions. The first one, I think, about the transit state. Yes, under international law, Nepal is a landlocked country, is entitled to the right of free access to and from the sea without any reciprocity. That's guaranteed by international law. That will not change. But there is nothing to prevent a landlocked country to become a transit state. Having maintained its status, is a landlocked country under international law enjoying the rights guaranteed, it can also serve as a transit state. That doesn't affect Nepal's rights under international law. It will enhance Nepal's prestige, it will enhance Nepal's economy, but under international law, Nepal can become a transit state. Nepal is a party to the WTO agreements, as you nicely mentioned, GATT and number of other treaties. Nepal is already under an obligation to allow free movement of goods, freedom of transit for Indian goods to China, Chinese goods to India, or for any other country which wishes to use Nepal as a transit route. So that will not affect Nepal's status as a landlocked country under international law. With regard to the multipolar and from bipolar to unipolar to multipolar, these are more of an international relations issues rather than an issue for an international lawyer to address. But again, what I would say is that the world is changing rapidly. There are new dynamics in international relations. Nepal has to be alert and wise to address these dynamics and take its own sensible foreign policy geared to enhancing its own national interests, regardless of the alliances that may or may not exist. Some of the alliances have worked well, some of them have not worked well. Non-aligned movement, for instance, has diminished its role greatly. So has the G77. Therefore, Nepal has to be assertive in projecting itself internationally, having a distinctive foreign policy. When global issues are considered, they should look to Nepal for inspiration and leadership in the areas in which it has developed its specialism. In my opinion, 21st century is the century of specialism. What are Nepal's specialities? In which areas the other states should look to Nepal for leadership? That's what I'm trying to say this afternoon. Soft power, I agree with you, and I also agree with Dr. Ramesh Dungel. Yes, the center I have proposed should certainly take those transactions into account and unearth some of the state practice of the past which have not been properly interpreted and archived. That's what I said, a serious think tank for a small country like Nepal. A serious think tank devoted to the study of not only classical international law, but modern international law and the current practice, where the world is going, what is happening in other parts of the world. How should our policy makers, decision makers should be informed by current policy. With reference to international investment treaty, that's what I said. The provisions in the treaties concluded 20 years ago. The nature, scope and meaning of the same terms. You may have the same treaty, but the current interpretation is different. If you do not understand the current interpretation, in law we say precedent, nazir. If we don't understand the current precedent, current practice of international courts and tribunals, Nepal will not be able to defend its interests successfully. Therefore, the center is needed. And soft power, Nepal has, as I said, the one of the objectives of my lecture this afternoon was to highlight what are the soft powers of Nepal. It has quite a few of them, and they should be utilized to advance Nepal's position internationally. And also goes back to the very first question: how long should Nepal continue receiving foreign aid? What is the foreign policy with regard to non-aligned movement? Yes, foreign aid has been a significant part of Nepal's endeavor for economic development, and international community is committed to, it's an obligation. By the way, United Kingdom, in my opinion, the information I have, is the only one country which has made it obligatory to grant foreign aid. Granting foreign aid is a voluntary thing, but in the UK they have enacted laws to ring-fence so-called foreign aid budget. So that is deriving from the so-called monetary consensus. Actually, there was a lot of debate in MCC. The origins of the MCC itself was the monetary conference, where the richer countries committed themselves to increasing significantly the share of foreign aid given to least developed countries, developing countries in general and least developed countries in particular. So if used sensibly, foreign aid can actually play the role that foreign investment does to stimulate the economy, to develop certain infrastructure, and of course, foreign aid itself may not work well if other arms of the state are not working properly. As I said, robust rule of law, independent judiciary, transparency, respect for property rights, intellectual property rights, other human rights should all be part and parcel. Nepal has begun this journey. It is on the threshold of a new world, new century. On that threshold, we have a contribution to make. So that taking all these things into account, we can formulate a sensible foreign policy which will deliver eventually the peace dividend that the people are longing for. Now, I can afford to have one very final round. I know there have been many hands, and our time is nearly up. I know the organizers said initially no more than 20 minutes. Very brief question. I have to pay attention to gender equality. So the lady here, you have the first question.
Well, my question to you is, Nepal being one of the member countries representing Himalayan Hindu Kush region, can Nepal take leadership in climate change actions? If yes, then could you please explain how? I'm Pragya Gimene, and I represent Institute of Foreign Affairs.
Good evening, Professor. Much compliment to you on a brilliant lecture. My name is Shekhar Gulchand. I'm the president of FNCCI. You spoke about neutrality, which I feel that we've been talking about neutrality for our long-term foreign policy. I think we've far too long dwelled in pseudo-nationalism, whereas nationalism should be about bringing prosperity to the people, and I think that everything else is pseudo. Just think about it that had we monetized our natural resources, which we have, I think our per capita income, we could have been a middle income country by now. Whereas this thing about neutrality and pseudo-nationalism is holding us back. My second question to you is, why are we in such a hurry to sign this international treaties like FATF or WTO, and why can't we think of what is necessary for our country? And do you think that it is important that now we should look inwards, like many other countries are looking inwards, to bring prosperity for their own people, and rather than just going ahead and signing international treaties? Thank you.
Good evening, sir. My name is Jagdishwar Pandey. I work for the Kantipur Delhi. I have short two questions. First one is, you have talked twice that rule-based system, rule-based international order. Can you brief it? Because few years back, there are a lot of explanation about the rule-based order from the Westerners. So I want to hear about that. And another question is that you also talk about the transit point between China and India. And China and India also share the border. So is there any compulsory that they should do transits from Nepal? So how can we can come together between China and India and Nepal.
The question, yes, very interesting and very important. That's what I say. Sagarmatha Sambhav, the idea behind it should be revived. Nepal should develop some expertise or specialism in certain areas, especially relating to this own part of the world, the Hindu Kush Himalayan belt. It will have an impact not only on Nepal but on most of the countries in South Asia. So environmental issues in general, yes, and then Himalayan ecology and the impact of the global climate change on the Himalayas generally would be an area where Nepal can provide leadership. I agree with you. With the gentleman from the FNCCI, yes, some people say pseudo-nationalism, but the fiercely patriotic nature of Nepali people has preserved the independence of the country thus far. I see nothing wrong in that one, but the time has come, as I said, one of the objectives of my lecture is to look beyond the immediate neighborhood and then aim for a global contribution, benefit, deal with the challenges brought about by globalization and benefit from the opportunities offered by globalization. That ties nicely to your question, what I meant by rules-based international order. You also mentioned WTO, that is relevant to his question. When we say rules-based international order, we mean the Charter of the United Nations, we mean Panchashil, we mean the WTO agreements, we mean the about 10 core international human rights treaties, we mean about 5-6 core international environmental law treaties. They are collectively called part of the rules-based international order. Nepal has a lot to benefit from them. Some of them, as I said, are not as favorable to developing countries as they should be, but again it's too late. But now, from henceforth, what new laws, new treaties could be concluded, which could be made part of the rules-based international order. When I say rules-based international order, based on these foundational principles of international law. That's what we can do. And with regard to the WTO treaties, yes, it was necessary, it was sensible for Nepal to join the global community. As I said, the objectives of the international human rights treaties, the objectives of the WTO treaties is eventually to create a borderless world. If you ask me, a borderless world in terms of free movement of goods, capital and services. That should be followed by free movement of people, but this is not possible. People want to protect their borders, immigration requirements, but ultimately you cannot achieve freedom of movement of goods, services and capital without acknowledging freedom of movement of people. That is the ultimate aim. For the fourth pillar, the world is slow. With regard to three pillars, freedom of movement of goods, capital and services, the WTO is championing that one. That is in the interest of Nepal. So what the treaties Nepal has ratified thus far are in the interest of Nepal. But how to benefit from them? That's what I say, how to benefit from them. Nepal is graduating out of the LDC status very soon. But that doesn't mean that Nepal will have to forego some of the concessions that it is entitled to under international law. So there are so many other benefits Nepal can exploit these treaties and enhance its economy and enhance its prestige internationally. With this response, I would like to bring this session to a close. I thank you very much for your attention, fascinating questions. I hope the dialogue continues. As Foreign Secretary Mr. Bharat Paudel said, the idea of launching this lecture series is to stimulate this kind of debate. So this should not be the start and finish of the debate. The debate should go on. I have thrown some of the ideas for food for thought. For decision makers, policy makers, civil society organizations, the ideas I have floated this afternoon, I hope will serve to continue the debate and dialogue that we are having today for the rest of the year. And when we meet again next year, then we can revive the debate. With these words, my personal thanks to you, and thank you and goodbye.
सर्वश्रेष्ठ खाता खोलो है आज नै सर्वश्रेष्ठ बचत र मुक्ति खाता